This evening, we're reading parts 8, New Hollywood in the 70s, the post 60s anti establishment, a tour versus the movie brats. Now, before we get started, I'm going to wait around a little bit. We've made quite the dent in this book already. Look at that. We're going to be getting about close to halfway through the book, which is fun. I can't wait to finish it. It'll feel like an accomplishment. So just going to wait around here for just a minute. Wait for people to join in. I'm excited to read this. He brought up the whole New Hollywood thing in the previous section, so it'd be interesting to see what else he has to say in depth about it. So just gonna wait a little bit longer before we get started. Well, it's been a minute, so how about how about we get started here in the next 30 seconds or so. Okay. Well, let's get started, shall we? In Peter Biskind's historical examination of New Hollywood in the 70s, Easy Rider, Raging Bulls, he relates a story of Dennis Hopper, fresh off his Easy Rider success, having dinner with Peter Bondovich and his wife Polly Platt and legendary old Hollywood director George Cukor. During the dinner, Hopper apparently mocked the old man's generation, saying, "We're going to bury you," with we meaning Dennis and his anti establishment brethren, and you meaning Cooker and the rest of the grumpy old farts still making movies at the end of the 60s. Bondovich and Platt were shocked and horrified to see this old master, whose work they revered, treated with such an alarming lack of respect. I hated Dennis for that. Peter told me decades later, and if the story went down how it's been told, Hopper deserved a punch in the nose. Nevertheless, it does illustrate the attitude that Dennis's hippie Hollywood had about old Hollywood as it gave way to new Hollywood. These new filmmakers had an anti establishment perspective. To them, John Ford, John Wayne, and Howard Hawks were the establishment. Charlton Heston was the establishment. Julie Andrews, Blake Andrews, and Rock Hudson were the establishment. And since My Fair Lady was definitely the establishment, so too was George Cukor. The post 60s anti establishment auteurs had just won a revolution. The old studio Broadway musical based extravaganza, The Sound of Music, My Fair Lady, Hello, Dolly, was finally at long last dead. Many filmmakers today can't wait for the day they can say that about superhero movies. Actually, yeah, I'm kind of on the same boat. The Hays Code was dead, and the rating board was alive. You could make a movie about any subject practically, and the material wouldn't have to be compromised. The peekaboo parlor games, when it came to sexuality that Hitchcock was forced to play, could be a thing of the past. And if you made it, thanks to the rating board, the distributor could release it across the country without some hick sheriff in some jerkwater county claiming you broke their obscenity laws. Well, hello, everybody. Love for Unique. Rodolfo. 6986 Jackass. Hello. Tony Cranley. Hi. Marcy Walker. What's up? Welcome. These anti establishment auteurs were as sorry to see the old studio system go bust as the French revolutionaries were to see Marie Antoinette vacate Versailles. Now, to be clear, the post 60s anti establishment auteurs were Robert Altman, Bob Rafelson, Hal Ashby, Paul Mazursky, Arthur Penn, Sam Peckinpah, Frank Perry, Michael Ritchie, William Friedkin, Richard Rush, John Cassavetes, and Jerry Schatzberg. Other strong but less prolific members of this group were Floyd Mutrow, Alan Arkin, Ozzie Davis, Paul Williams, not the diminutive songwriter, James Frawley, Francis Ford Coppola at the time, Stuart Hagman, Melvin Van Peebles, James Bridges, Brian De Palma at the time, Monty Hellman, Harvey Hart, and of course, the Easy Rider Trio, Dennis Hopper, Peter Fonda, and Jack Nicholson. These were the Hollywood Hills hippies, the Malibu Beach beatniks, and it was the foreign directors of the 50s and 60s, plus Orson Welles, that had made them want to be filmmakers, but it was the counterculture that had made them want to be artists. After the devastation of Europe and Asia during World War II, once countries started making movies again, they found that they were making them for a much more adult audience than existed before the war. And world cinema proceeded to get more and more adult as the 50s turned into the 60s. However, in America, despite the best efforts of men like Stanley Kramer and Otto Preminger, Hollywood movies still remain stubbornly immature and committed to the idea of fun for the whole family. But with the rise of the 60s counterculture, the explosion of a youth culture movement, and new maturity that was introduced to popular music, and the excitement generated by films like Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, and especially the surprise success of Dennis Hopper's Easy Rider, New Hollywood was ushered in. An adult oriented Hollywood with a 60s sensibility and an anti establishment agenda. And by 1970, this new Hollywood was Hollywood, and films left over from that other sensibility, like Billy Wilder's The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, Blake Edwards' Darling Lily, Vincent Minnelli's On a Clear Day You Can See Forever, Guy Green's A Walk in the Spring Rain, George Stevens' The Only Game in Town, William Wyler's The Liberation of L.B. Jones, Alfred Hitchcock's Topaz, and Howard Hawks' Rio Lobo were deemed dead on arrival. And except for Edwards and Wilder's films, those films were dead on arrival, though I can somewhat make a sense of Wyler L.B.'s Jones, but the attitude of both the hip critics and the audience of the day wasn't that much different from Dennis Hopper's at the infamous dinner. Fuck George Cooker, fuck George Stevens, fuck Williams Wyler, fuck Howard Hawks. Like the movie brat generation that came after them, these anti-establishment auteurs watched old movies growing up too. But unlike Bondovich, Spielberg, Scorsese, and Big John Milius, when this era of filmmakers watched old movies on television, they weren't as enamored of what they saw. When they watched John Ford westerns, they were usually appalled by the jingoistic white supremacy on display. When they watched The Searchers, they didn't see a conflicted man trying to find his place in a society that had outlived his usefulness. They saw a movie about an Indian hating racist bastard who is ultimately offered absolution by a grateful white community. And they saw a director who co signed that absolution and expected the audience to do the same. They rejected the morality of the wrap up at the end of Ford's Fort Apache, where Henry Fonda's genocidal cavalry officer is lionized in death for the greater good of the cavalry, esprit de corps, and for white America as a whole. The anti establishment auteurs wanted to remake John Ford's movies, but not the way Scorsese and Schrader would do with Taxi Driver and Hardcore. They wanted to remake Fort Apache from the Apache's perspective. In the case of Arthur Penn with Little Big Man, and Ralph Nelson with Soldier Blue, and Robert Aldrich, not post 60s, hardly a hippie, but absolutely anti establishment, with Alzana's Raid. They did. The reason to do historical pictures in this new climate was to finally examine and demonstrate America's history of fascism, racism, and hypocrisy, all the elements that old Hollywood spent 50 years whitewashing in the historical pictures of old. Jesse James wasn't Henry King's dashing Tyrone Power. He was Robert Duvall's homicidal religious fanatic and Philip Kaufman's The Great Northfield, Minnesota Raid. Billy the Kid wasn't Johnny Mac Brown's smiling charmer, or even Paul Newman's brooding method acting turn in The Left Handed Gun. He was Michael J. Pollard's creepy little punk and Stan Dragotti's Dirty Little Billy, or Chris Christopherson's Billy and Sam Peckinpah's Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, a Billy who slays with all the callousness of a modern day serial killer. General George Armstrong Custer wasn't Errol Flynn, long haired, hard drinking, two fisted hero. He was Richard Mulligan's racial cleansing nincompoop and Arthur Penn's little big man. Wyatt Earp wasn't Burt Lancaster's Ramrod straight lawman. He was Harris Yulin's fascist cop and Frank Perry's doc. In Perry and writer Pete Hamill's version of events, there wasn't so much a gunfight at the OK Corral than Wyatt and his brothers just murdering the Clantons in cold blood. And the reason is made abundantly clear: power is and money. During times of great political turmoil, modern political issues are always conveniently found in America's past. When Arthur Penn, Robert Aldrich, and Ralph Nelson take on the subject of the American Indian Wars, every parallel with the war in Vietnam is encouraged, to the extent that Penn cast an Asian woman to play Hoffman's American Indian bride, who's savagely slaughtered by the cavalry wearing coats and little big man, just in case it's not obvious to everyone. In Abraham Polonsky's Tell Them Willie Boy is here, Robert Blake's outlaw Indian on the run for a self-defense murder represents a modern-day Black Panther political fugitive, and Robert Redford's golden-haired posse-leading marshal represents the older white male Western archetype. And just in case we don't get it, he's named Coop, as in Gary Cooper. Unlike the movie brats who followed them, these filmmakers didn't want to do their version of Psycho, Dressed to Kill, or The Searchers, Taxi Driver, and Hardcore, or Little Caesar, The Godfather, or Flash Gordon, Star Wars, or Bringing Up Baby, What's Up Doc. When these directors would redo films, it's films in the spirit of Fellini, Truffaut, and Renoir that they aspire to. When Paul Mazursky was faced with the task of following his surprise smash hit Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, he placed his Fellini influence front and center with his paraphrase take on the Italians' film Eight and a Half, which he titled Alex in Wonderland. When faced with his own morality due to his recent open heart surgery, director Bob Fosse looked inward, and guess what? He saw Eight and a Half too. Bonnie and Clyde was originally developed by screenwriters Robert Benton and David Newman as a Hollywood movie for Francois Truffaut. And when Truffaut turned it down, he was too scared, thank God. Who did they get? Arthur Penn, the only Hollywood director working at a studio level who in 1965 tried to do a French New Wave style movie in America, Mickey 1, starring Warren Beatty. Almost all of Frank Perry's movies feel like American French films, but he wasn't alone. Coppola's The Rain People, Schatzberg's Puzzle of a Downfall Child, Altman's Images, and later Three Women, and Kirshner's Loving and Up the Sandbox all play like American versions of European movies. The first half of the new Hollywood 70s seemed to want to test the limits of both its newfound freedom and the type of edgy material it was allowed to make. And that's why cinema lovers still enjoy discovering those films to this day. But to the casual moviegoer who didn't know the difference between New Hollywood and Old Hollywood and lived someplace other than New York City, Los Angeles, San Francisco, or a college campus, all they knew was if you see a movie, you'd kind of like to understand it. Did they understand 2001? How about Catch 22? How about Brewster's McCloud? How about Little Murders? Without a critic to tell them what to think, did they understand Five Easy Pieces? Did they misunderstand Joe? You see a movie, you want to like the hero. Do you like Jeff Bridges and Sam Waterston's in Rancho Deluxe? Of course not. They're assholes. You like Donald Sutherland's Hawkeye and MASH. But do you like Sutherland's Alex in Wonderland? Are we even supposed to? Or work from the expectation that there will be a hero? Is Maccabi a hero? Is Travis Bickle? Is Major Charles Rain? Is Elliot Gold's Philip Morlow? Are Freebie and the Bean? Is Warren Beatty's George Roundy and Shampoo? I'm not just making fun of people back then who didn't get it. I'm making fun of people now. I screened Shampoo on an Oscar-winning screenwriter who had never seen it, and when it was over, his response was, "So it's just about a guy who's trying to open up a chair salon." And yeah, I'm having a good laugh at Callie Corey's expense, but she isn't the only person to say that. The casual moviegoer knew movies had rougher language than before, but that doesn't mean they weren't ready for the last detail. They knew movies were more violent now. They liked that True Grit was rougher than the usual John Wayne Western. They liked the street realism of the French Connection. They liked it when Dustin Hoffman wore torn in Straw Dogs. They liked Dirty Harry shooting Black Panthers while he chewed on a hot dog, but that doesn't mean they were ready for the throat slitting scene in The Wild Bunch, or the singing in the rain scene in A Clockwork Orange, or the male sodomy rape in Deliverance, or the climax of Joe. Audiences like the new risque elements in movies like Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, The Owl, and The Pussycat in Shampoo. They liked the funny discussions of sex in Summer of 42. They thought it was funny when hot lips got exposed in the shower and MASH, but that didn't mean they were ready for the Tushy scene in Where's Popa, when Ruth Gordon bites George Siegel on the ass. Maybe they liked Julie Christie's and Donald Sutherland's Making Love and Nichols Rogue's Don't Look Now. Maybe, like my mom, they thought Ron O'Neal and Sheila Fraser's bathtub scene in Gordon Parks' Junior Superfly was sexy, but were they were they ready for Oliver Reed and Ellen Bates' nude wrestling match and Ken Russell's Women in Love? Were they disturbed, aroused, or both by Susan George's rape and Sam Peckinpah's Straw Dogs? And if they were they disturbed right away or only at the end? And was that the disturbing part? Sequences like these instilled a growing sense of anxiety that the audience may be subjugated to inside a darkened theater with a room full of strangers. I mean, if you bought a ticket to Russ Mayer's Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, you probably had a good idea what you were getting into. But most audiences who bought a ticket to see Deliverance didn't know they paid money to see Ned Beatty get fucked in the ass. Audiences who didn't live in New York or Los Angeles or didn't read the New York Times or the New Yorker or the Village Voice began to become afraid of modern movies. After a steady diet of movies like The Panic in Needle Park, Joe, Lenny, Played as It Lays, The Sporting Club, The Hunting Party last summer, and Dusty and Sweets McGee, regular moviegoers were becoming wary of modern American movies. The darkness, the drug use, the embrace of sensation, the violence, the sex, the sexual violence. But even more than that, they became wary of the anti everything cynicism. As Pauline Kael suggested at the beginning of the decade, after the best movie suggested the only sensible recourse for Americans is to get stoned. Was everything a bummer? Was everything a drag? Was every movie about some guy with problems? For hip audiences, the hero dying futilely at the end of the picture was a come on. It reaffirmed their pose. You can't win. When Robert Blake and Stacy Keach died at the end of Electric Glide and Blue and the New Gener- Centurions, and when Fonda and Hopper bought in The Easy Rider, it was senseless and tragically ironic. But that felt good because it reaffirmed the senselessness and tragic irony of American life. The senseless of their deaths made them heroes. In the first half of the 70s, you weren't a hero for fighting a war overseas and killing a bunch of enemy soldiers. You were a hero if you fought the war, went back home, got shot in a liquor store robbery. But that's the Jack Nicholson audience, the Elliot Gold audience, and the Dustin Hoffman audience. Burt Reynolds and Charles Bronson audiences didn't feel that way. When Burt Reynolds and Robert Aldrich follow up, The Longest Yard came out, the gloomy cop film Hustle, it opened up to dynamic business until audiences found out Burt died at the end. And it was a 70s cynical death. Burt's audience wasn't cynical. They liked America just fine. They'd rather watch him crack jokes about his early movies and see what clothes he wore on Johnny Carson for free than pay to see a bummer. If you wanted to watch a Western, it was usually directed by Andrew McLaglen or his buddy Burt Kennedy and starred old farts like John Wayne, Kirk Douglas, Robert Mitchum, James Stewart, Henry Fonda, or Dean Martin. The younger guys still doing straight westerns were James Gardner and George Peppard. But if it was a true 70s picture and not a nostalgic throwback for an aging star's aging audience, then it was an anti-western. Almost every genre film made for a while was an anti-genre. film, with the idea behind the film being to expose the absurdity and unsavory politics that have hidden underneath said genre since the beginning of Hollywood. And then suddenly a string of movies: The Last Picture Show, What's Up Doc, The Godfather, American Graffiti, Paper Moon, Jaws, Carrie, Star Wars, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, they were easily understandable, cut for maximum audience enjoyment, not artistic indulgence, and were new takes on old familiar genres. And these movies ended up being the films the public was waiting for. The movie brats, so dubbed because of Michael Pye's book length critical study of them, were the first film school educated generation of young white male directors raised on television who emerged and ended up defining the decade with their snazzy pop flicks. The movement had as its members Francis Ford Coppola, Peter Bogdanovich, Brian De Palma, Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, John Milius, Steven Spielberg, and Paul Schrader. Coppola, the first film school graduate to break into the business, first with Roger Corman and later with Warner Bros., preceded the other from film students to professional filmmakers to auteurs by a decade. And as such, he was sort of this group's artistic and spiritual leader, godfather, a spot he shared sweetly with John Cassavetes on one end of the scale and Roger Corman on the other. As John Milius once told me, we all wanted to make Hollywood a better place because we were there. But those were Francis' dreams. He was the only one who tried to do anything about it. And in a way, you could say all those dreams failed. Hollywood isn't a better place because E.T. made $300 million. Spielberg's place is a better place. Coppola Coppola's championship of Lucas and Milius is well known. Francis produced both of Lucas's first two films, THX 1138 and American Graffiti, and directed Milius' script for Apocalypse Now, which started life as a directorial project for Lucas. But his behind the scenes support for Scorsese is lesser known. According to Milius, nobody championed the young Scorsese like Francis, at one point suggesting Scorsese should direct the Godfather sequel. It was Francis who suggested Scorsese to Ellen Burstyn when she wanted a young director to helm Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. He also suggested Scorsese to Al Pacino and produced Martin Bergman when they went looking for a new director when John Avildsen dropped out of Serpico. And according to Scorsese, Coppola even passed on a copy of the Mean Street script to Mr. Pacino. Coppola and Bogdanovich shared a company together, along with William Friedkin, called the Directors' Company. It produced one Coppola contribution, The Conversation, one of his best, two Bogdanovich films, Paper Moon, one of his best, and Daisy Miller, one of his most underrated, and absolutely no Friedkin, even though he got a nice slice of those Paper Moon profits. Schrader wrote Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and The Last Temptation of Christ for Scorsese, Obsession for De Palma, and an aborted first draft of Close Encounters for Spielberg. John Milius would produce Schrader's second directorial effort, Hardcore. Milius would dictate over the telephone Quint's speech about the USS Indianapolis for his buddy Spielberg and would later write and produce Spielberg's epic comedy 1941. Brian De Palma would introduce Robert De Niro to Scorsese and be the one to hand him Schrader's script for Taxi Driver. And De Palma and Lucas conducted joint casting sessions for Carrie and Star Wars because Lucas was quiet and De Palma did all the talking. The young actors thought George was Brian's assistant. These filmmakers were and look young, and they also look talented and dynamic. Just look at them during this period. Spielberg naked except for baseball cap, dirty tennis shoes, and cut off white Levi shorts, sitting in Bruce the mechanical shark's mouth on the set of Jaws. Scorsese in his crisp white button-down shirt on the set of Taxi Driver, scratching his black beard next to Robert De Niro in his weirded out Travis Bickle mode. Bogdanovich in a sleek black leather jacket on the set of Paper Moon, squatting down on his hunches so he's eye level with little 8-year-old Tatum O'Neal in her Addie Loggins overalls. Lucas, almost dashingly handsome in his shrilling coat on the set of Star Wars, sitting in a director's chair alongside Alec Guinness, wrapped up in his Obi-Wan Kenobi robe. Milius in desert headgear to protect him from the Moroccan sun on the set of The Wind and The Lion, sitting alongside John Huston looking mythic in his ambassador uniform costume. De Palma, young and slim, viewfinder dangling from his neck, yucking it up with Tom Smothers and Orson Welles on the set of his first studio feature, Get to Know Your Rabbit. Coppola, in the pages of Life magazine, dressed in a colorful Hawaiian shirt, trimmer than he's ever looked, trapezing around the massive sets he built in the Philippines for Apocalypse Now. Schrader built up a beefy like high school wrestling coach, posing in front of a poster for Joseph H. Lewis's Gun Crazy in the pages of Esquire. That Esquire article, February 1975, was called The Ninth Era and was written by L.M. Kit Carson, David Holzman himself. In Kit's piece, he's the first to identify this growing group of filmmakers who are taking shape to lead the industry. But Kit's piece prophesies a whole new top of the line: directors, producers, writers, actors. Under actors, he had Robert De Niro, Pam Grier, and Joe Don Baker. Under producers, he had Mike Medove, Gerald Aries, Julia, and Michael Phillips, Tony Bill, and Lawrence Gordon. Under writers, he had Schrader, Robert Town, David Ward, Joan Tewksbury, and Willard Huyck, and Gloria Katz. Under directors, he has Spielberg, Scorsese, Lucas, De Palma, Hal Ashby, Terrence Malick, and Ralph Bakshi. In his 1979 seminal study of 70s cinema titled American Film Now, James Monaco called the group the Whiz Kids and included Bogdanovich, Lucas, De Palma, Spielberg, Scorsese, and adds William Friedkin to the mix, while Coppola is given pantheon status along Cassavetes, Altman, Ritchie, and Mazursky. Diane Jacobs called her 1977 book Hollywood Renaissance and included as her pantheon John Cassavetes, Robert Altman, Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Paul Mazursky, Mitchell Ritchie, and Hal Ashby. And Michael Pye's study with the name that struck, the movie brats, kept the film school aspect literal by only including Coppola, Lucas, De Palma, Milius Scorsese, and the wonderkind Spielberg. What set the movie brats apart from the earlier generation of directors that had come before them, even more than their youth and film school education, was the fact that mostly they were film geeks. It's almost amusing to think of a time when filmmakers took an attitude of almost indifference when talking about cinema as an art form. But before Scorsese and Bogdanovich and Spielberg, that was the case. Even the generation just before them, the anti-establishment auteurs, didn't talk about movies the way they did. Bogdanovich talks about a golden age of Hollywood with more authority than any director since Francis Truffaut. No doubt, at the time, Peter had seen more movies in 1 year than Altman had seen in his life. Does anybody really think Altman watched other people's movies? Most filmmakers of earlier eras wouldn't be able to read Paul Schrader's transcendental style in film, no less write it. They were the first generation of filmmakers who grew up watching movies not just in cinemas but on television, which meant they saw a lot more movies. They were also the first generation of filmmakers to grow up watching television on television. The directors before them, Peckinpah, Altman, Ritchie, Mark Riddell, Sidney Pollack, John Frankenheimer, Ralph Nelson, George Roy Hill, Don Siegel were too busy making television to watch it. When the movie brats were young, they grooved on movies the anti-establishment auteurs wouldn't be caught dead watching, God forbid being forced to make. Henry Levin's Journey to the Center of the Earth, Richard Fleischer's 2,000 Leagues Under the Sea, George Powell's The Time Machine, Ken Atkin's Swiss Family Robinson, J. Lee Thompson's The Guns of Navarone. Spielberg can quote the entire James Robertson Justice prologue narration. Roger Corman, to the generation of filmmakers that preceded the movie brats, was a low-rent colleague. When Warren Beatty considered working with Corman on a Robert Towne script titled The Long Ride Home, made as a Time for Killing without Towne's name, Corman screened for Beatty his last film, The Tomb of Ligeia, also scripted by Towne. Beatty's response to Towne about Tomb: "When I got married, I don't expect my bride to be a virgin, but I'd rather she not be the biggest whore in town." But Scorsese loves Ligeia so much he shows a clip of it in Mean Streets. To the movie brats, Roger Corman, even before he became a mentor, was a hero. They loved movies, dreamed movies, even received degrees in movies back when that was a dubious major. When the anti-establishment auteurs did genre films, they engaged in genre deconstruction. The movie brats embraced genre films for their own ends. They didn't want, for the most part, to make art film meditations or genre films. They wanted to make the best genre films ever made. When Jaws came out in 1975, it might not have been the best film ever made, but it was easily the best movie ever made. Nothing ever made before it even came close. Because for the first time, the man at the helm wasn't Richard Fleischer or Jack Smite or Michael Anderson executing a studio assignment, but a natural born filmmaker genius who grooved on exactly this kind of movie and would kill himself to deliver the exact version that was in his head. Spielberg's command of Jaws showed how clumsy and badly timed most studio genre films were. Logan's Run, Airport 1975, Towering Inferno, the 70s James Bond movies. This new generation didn't aspire, like the generation before them, to adapt the great literature of their day. Catch 22, Slaughterhouse 5, The Day of the Locust, or Little Big Man. The books they were drawn to were more popular reads that they thought would make good movies. Jaws, Carrie, The Godfather, The Last Picture Show, Addie Prey, Paper Moon. Also, for the most part, the movies brats entered the industry via exploitation cinema. The anti-establishment auteurs, for the most part, took themselves far, far too seriously to do exploitation films. Television, yes. Drive-in fodder, no. As far as they were concerned, the American International Pictures logo wasn't a studio presentation credit, it was a stigma. It was the home of horror flicks and biker flicks, over the hill stars, Ray Milland and Boris Karloff, slumming stars, Bette Davis, and dubious stars, Vincent Price and Fabian, and the place where failed international productions starring Elizabeth Taylor and Peter O'Toole went to die. But the movie brats were young enough to be the audiences that American International Pictures were aiming for. They were young enough to see the films in actual drive-ins. They were the first generation of leading Hollywood filmmakers who watched Gordon Douglas' science fiction classic Them because it was about giant ants. In a way, that was the reason that the movie brats wrestled the zeitgeist away from the post 60s anti establishment auteurs that had started the new Hollywood era that the youngsters were thriving in. The hippie directors couldn't understand or didn't want to understand that some people watch movies about giant ants and take them seriously. Heh, not too bad. A little shorter than I expected. But yeah, it's pretty good. I didn't really know that. I mean, I had a sense about directors like Coppola, Spielberg, all those, that group. I always had kind of a sense that they were a wave of new generation filmmakers, but to go that in depth is another thing. Yeah, I enjoyed it too. Let's see what's next. So next is a movie called Sisters. So that's interesting. I wonder what that's all about. This one is a longer chapter, I think. Let me see. Yeah, seems like a longer. Daisy Miller. Interesting. Yeah, then once we get a little further, let's see how much further. We Taxi Driver. Ooh, that's gonna be good. That's gonna be real good. Yeah, let's just leave it there. Do a fast read. That's okay. Really appreciate everybody. Could be about female movies. I don't know actually. I don't know. Oh, we'll see tomorrow. So yeah, tomorrow, same time, 9 o'clock p.m. Central. We'll start reading Sisters. Yeah, I'm not sure. It'll be interesting. We'll see what happens. Okay, so that's it for tonight. Yeah, exactly. Take care, everybody. Bye for now. And I think you're the only one watching, Rodolfo. But yeah, I'll see you tomorrow night. So take care for now. Till next time.